warning! Oh no! Oh no! FBI? Who is this FBI? What are they trying to warn us about?
America, the greatest country on earth.
Oh, fuck yeah!
America, fuck yeah! Coming again to save the motherfucking day, yeah! America, fuck yeah! Freedom is the only way, yeah!
Oh man, this is gonna be sweet! No question about it!
A mythology so entrenched, our most beloved personalities urge us never to question it. But what if we did question it?
Oh, fuck me! Alright, let's question it.
Now, hold on, Patriots. I know what you're thinking. America's done some pretty great stuff. And you're right. We built a kick-ass democracy.
Oh, 46 seconds in, and already we're hitting a wall here, folks. It's too bad illegal aliens don't do that! That's Republic. Federal Republic. If you pinko commies says your Pledge of Allegiance once in a while, instead of burying your noses in Karl Marx's ass, you might know that. I also would have accepted constitutional representative democracy.
Walked on the moon, and we built universities so prestigious that even Taliban warlords send their kids.
I'm trying to figure out exactly what your motivation was in saying that. You, who at one point wouldn't even say the words, Islamic terrorism! You, who think that flying the American flag at said universities is triggering and run to your safe spaces. You, who are so fucking limp about everything that you can't even look at a girl anymore without it being considered rape, while it becomes harder and harder to not only meet someone, but get married and start a family. But oh, that's right, no point bringing kids into the world that's just gonna end in 12 years anyway! While they, the Taliban guys you so snidely remarked about, get treated better than you treat your own countrymen. So much so that they're almost a protected class, while they breed like fucking rabbits, raising little Taliban beanos taught to hate this country and everything it stands for. Or maybe you were referring to the University of Nebraska's attempts at westernizing the children of Taliban warlords in cooperation with the U.S. oil company to try to persuade the Taliban to grant valuable oil pipeline rights in Afghanistan. Could have been that.
Now, listen, of course, there's no single way to measure greatness, but one good test is how we rank into OECD, which is basically a golf club of 36 countries, predominantly wealthy, Western, and democratic.
A golf club, huh? So, what, lots of Jews and valet parking?
And unlike most golf clubs, this one's got some diversity, too.
So yeah, you were implying that. All right.
America is the richest country in this club, but we're also the poorest.
Make up your mind, dude. Is he gonna shit or is he gonna kill us?
With a whopping 18% poverty rate, closer to Mexico than Western Europe.
As of 2017, the poverty rate was 12.3% and falling consistently since 2014. So I don't know what your meter is, but for a family of 4, for example, that line would be $25,750. Either adding or subtracting $4,420 for each person, making the poverty line for a single person $11,490. And still, the poorest people in America live better than most of the rest of humanity. I mean, 95% of the US homeless population owns cell phones. And of them, 80% have a smartphone. But there's much more to it than just owning what was once considered a luxury. The bottom 5% of the American income distribution is still richer than 68% of the world's inhabitants. So when he says this,
closer to Mexico than Western Europe,
he's not only conveniently leaving out Eastern Europe, like Russia, for example, where our bottom 10% live better than their top 10%. But our bottom 10% also live better than Mexico's top 10%, and Portugal's top 10%. So yes, our poverty rate might be closer to Mexico's, but our poor are still living better than Mexico's top percentile. As far as Western Europe, about the only country that 10% fares better in would be Sweden, with Finland and Denmark being about equal with the US. And yet, we're still told that those countries, those socialist democracies, take better care of their poor. Well, they don't, and yet...
You pay far out the ass for it.
12.8 million American children live in poverty. That's almost 1 in 5 of our kids. And speaking of kids, turns out at the level of high school science, we're 19th of 36. Reading, 20th. And math, a dismal 30th.
American scores on those categories are pretty dismal. These numbers are estimated from testing 15-year-old kids, however, and with underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes, they're basically testing retards. Overall, we rank 17th in education, with Finland being first, and in higher education, we top the list. But mainly because we have a lot of Asians here, so, Asians!
Now, I'm not that good at math, not America's fault, but that does not add up well. And neither does this. We spend more on healthcare than any other country in the golf club, especially out of our own private little pockets. But we live sicker and shorter lives. We're fatter.
Now, I'm not good at math either, but the poorest country and the fattest country, that doesn't equal up either, does it? And of course it's from our own pockets. But the democratic socialist countries pay for healthcare out of their pocket too.
You pay far out the ass for it.
You are either going to pay out of pocket to an insurance company or pay out of pocket to the government. But yes, the US is number 1 in healthcare spending. We are also number 1 in research and development, like new prescription medications as well as medical technological advancements. So it's no coincidence that we not only spend the most on healthcare, but we also have the best healthcare system in the world, with the shortest ER wait times and the most selection and choices in not just doctors, but in course of care you can receive. It's also no coincidence that the rest of the world benefits from that. All of those democratic socialist healthcare countries that all of the lefties love so much couldn't exist without us.
Globally, we're more likely to see newborns die. We're even behind Bosnia.
Oh boy, where to start with this one? Okay, to put it simply, the universal guidelines used to measure infant mortality are grossly inaccurate. The New York Times are using a report published in 2011, spearheaded by Mikhail Ostergaard and the World Health Organization, focusing specifically on neonatal mortality, that's mortality rates in the first 4 weeks of life, and has been used ever since as an indictment of the state of U.S. healthcare. The obvious discrepancy being that some things aren't always so black and white and can be far more nuanced than just because healthcare. The following is from an article by the National Review. Yet, it's not that simple. Infant and neonatal mortality rates are complex, multifactorial endpoints that oversimplify heterogeneous inputs, many of which have no relation to healthcare at all. Moreover, these statistics gleaned from the widely varied countries of the world are plagued by inconsistencies, problematic definitions, and gross inaccuracies, all of which disadvantage the ranking of the US, where accuracy is paramount. In other words, there are challenges and limitations when comparing these statistics. Most babies who die in poor countries, for example, are never even registered at birth. Just throw it in the trash! While it's estimated that a full 3/4 of the world's neonatal deaths are counted only through highly unreliable household surveys, instead of being reported at the time of death by doctors or healthcare professionals in a hospital, as it is in the United States. Yeah, hey there, Toots. So, any babies die recently? There's also the misclassification of live births as stillbirths in many countries that would exclude most neonatal deaths. Which brings me to gross differences in the fundamental definition of live birth, invalidate comparisons of early neonatal death rates. This, again, obviously from the National Review article. The United States strictly adheres to the World Health Organization's definition of live birth. Any infant, irrespective of the duration of the pregnancy, which breathes or shows any other evidence of life, whether or not the umbilical cord has been cut or the placenta is attached, and uses a strictly implemented linked birth and infant death dataset. On the contrary, Many other nations, including highly developed countries in Western Europe, use far less strict definitions, all of which underreport the live births of more fragile infants who soon die. As a consequence, they falsely report more favorable neonatal and infant mortality rates. That underreporting mentioned can lead to a 10 to 30% discrepancy in the totals.
But we have freedom in America, and everyone's jealous or something.
The enemies of freedom.
Pursuing the enemies of freedom.
The enemies of freedom.
And other enemies of freedom.
Turns out, a lot of countries have freedoms.
Oh, what? You're gonna show all Republicans saying enemies of freedom and leave out Reagan? For shame!
As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or ever. We are Americans.
Oh man, they show AOC sandwiched between Kim Jong-un and fucking Castro. Brilliant, man. Mwah. First of all, it's worth pointing out that in all of the clips shown, they were referring to enemies of freedom on a global scale, not just threats posed to the freedoms of those living in America. Because, yes, other countries have freedom. And on behalf of America, you're welcome, France. You're welcome, France. You ungrateful, snail-sucking, frog-munching fat. So, once again, I'm miffed by your motivation here. The clip of then Vice President Richard Nixon is from his 1960 acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention and was in reference to Soviet Premier Khrushchev.
That it was not Mr. de Gaulle or Mr. Macmillan or Mr. Adenauer, but Mr. Kennedy who made the rash and impulsive suggestion that President Eisenhower could have apologized or sent regrets to Mr. Khrushchev for the U-2 flights, which the President had ordered to save our country from surprise attacks. But formidable as will be the diplomatic and military problems confronting the next president, far more difficult and critical will be the decisions he must make to meet and defeat the enemies of freedom in an entirely different kind of struggle.
Now, you have to remember that this was during the Cold War, and I'm sure Nixon knew that President Eisenhower was already planning with the CIA for what would become known under Kennedy as the Bay of Pigs, and would ultimately lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That being said, I'm going to go out on a limb here, because I'm a squirrel, and say that anyone who has 162 nuclear warheads pointed at your country just 100 miles off the coast is an enemy. Khrushchev was also the man who basically built the Berlin fucking Wall. So I'm going to see those 162 nuclear warheads, and I'm going to raise you a wall down the middle of an entire fucking city, separating husbands from wives, parents from children, and killing anyone who tried to escape. I'll throw in calling anyone who does that an enemy of freedom. The Bush clip is from his 2006 State of the Union address.
In this decisive year, you and I will make choices that determine both the future and the character of our country. We will choose to act confidently in pursuing the enemies of freedom, or retreat from our duties in the hope of an easier life.
So, this is where I know the New York Times are either lazy, stupid, or intellectually dishonest. It's more than likely a hat trick, because just 2 minutes after Bush says this,
we will choose to act confidently in pursuing the enemies of freedom,
he says this.
At the start of 2006, more than half the people of our world live in democratic nations. And we do not forget the other half. In places like Syria and Burma, Zimbabwe, North Korea, and Iran, because the demands of justice and the peace of this world require their freedom as well.
Why, it's almost as if he's recognizing the fact that there are hundreds of countries that have freedom.
Things that make you go,
We know other countries have freedom, but we here in the United States, we, the people, have a lot to be proud about. We have the oldest constitution in the world by 40 years. We invented the idea of freedom from tyranny. Compared to the rest of the world and other countries that have constitutions, the United States goes to great lengths to protect even offensive forms of speech that the rest of the world prohibits. I am, of course, talking about that ambiguous moving goalpost that some call hate speech, the big tech companies call "we just hate that" speech, and Britain seems to call whomever we don't like speech.
And while we boast about them, using our rights is a different story. Only 56% of Americans turn out to vote, while it's closer to 80% in countries like Denmark and Australia.
That's because Australia's brand of freedom penalizes you for not exercising your freedom to vote. Voting is compulsory in Australia. In other words, you aren't free not to vote in a federal election without a legitimate reason and are fined for not voting. As far as Denmark, in the most recent election, that's the 2019 EU parliamentary election held just this past May, they recorded historic turnouts. Of the 4,239,230 eligible voters, 66% either made it to the ballots or decided to vote by post. 66%. Again, I'm not good at math, but some basic subtraction would indicate that in reality, Denmark's voting turnout, at their historic best, is closer to America's average than Australia's. And are you really saying that Americans don't use their rights? I would say we use the hell out of our rights.
When I shoot, I think it's so much fun than playing with anything else that's in my room.
I have over 4,000 weapons in my name, over 200 machine guns. I have mortars, bazookas, tanks, half-tracks, attack jeeps, flamethrower, and everything I have is legal in the state of Colorado.
Anybody break in on me, I'm gonna kill him.
People like you just don't like those rights, or want to abolish, control, limit, silence, or censor the most basic of those rights. The most fundamental of our rights, the very foundation of which are the building blocks of our Constitution, the building blocks of our country, the building blocks of our republic. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed! But I'm sure you'll have something to say about that later too.
And it's getting worse. This year, America slid on global rankings of corruption and freedom and dropped from a functional to a flawed democracy.
What constitutes a flawed democracy? I'm glad you asked. The metric used to determine this is from the Economist Intelligence Unit and is scored on 5 categories: electoral process and pluralism, civil liberties, the functioning of government, political participation, and political culture. Now, the average Joe probably knows very little to nothing about any of these topics, and the New York Times knows this and takes full advantage of it, like a roofied schoolgirl on prom night, like a cat in a crippled henhouse, like a Palestinian valet parking in an Israeli country club, like Kirstie Alley at Hometown Buffet, by mixing just the right amount of information with suppression of information. They have to mention the fact that we've slipped just below the mark and are now a flawed democracy, because of course they do! It fits the overall narrative of their hit piece here. And they make it sound far more ominous than it really is. Any country scoring between 8 and 10 is a functioning democracy. We fell from an 8.0 to a 7.98. They even show that the downgrade isn't related to the Trump presidency for a hot second there. What they're not going to tell you is that Trump is more than likely a direct symptom of that trend and not a cause. Oddly enough, there are a couple of things directly related to this that they mention later for some reason, instead of including them right here, like these.
As elections are tampered with, water can't be drunk from taps, citizens don't trust uniformed officers, infrastructure is crumbling.
All of those things can factor into the ratings. Now, I wonder where did the culture of not trusting the police, the hate towards the police, and the legitimacy of domestic terror and racist organizations like Black Lives Matter and Antifa come from? Where did the sudden surge in race riots come from? Who really allowed Russians to interfere knew about it and did nothing. By the time Obama was leaving office, 67% of Americans felt as if the country was, and I quote, going to hell in a handbasket. That is 67%. The Great Divider was more concerned with protecting his legacy than anything else. In fact, that was Obama's #1 reason for backing Hillary, to protect his legacy. Why he would want to take credit for anything he did, I don't know.
So what, besides our economy and military, are we actually #1 in? Turns out...
Oh, hold it now. Whoa, did you catch that? Wait, let's back this up.
So what, besides our economy and military, are we actually #1 in?
Yeah, that's what you call bearing the lead, folks. Also known as bearing the lead. Let me ask you a question there, New York Times. On a global scale, what besides economy and military even fucking matter? We have the most powerful military in the world, bar none! There really isn't a second place. We mop the floor with other countries, and our economy is booming right now. Our GDP is 51% higher than the second highest ranking economy in the world, that being China, of course. Our stock market is booming right now. Unemployment is at historic lows. And going back to what I said earlier, quality of life here in America is unsurpassed. Well, in most places, but you know what? We'll get to that in a minute.
Turns out, a lot of things. Civilian gun ownership, mass shootings, TV watching, prescription drug abuse, prison population. Oh, and almost #1 on environmental damage, edged out by China.
Alright, let's do these one at a time.
Civilian gun ownership.
They say gun ownership like it's a bad thing.
Mass shootings.
Mass shootings are unfortunate and a terrible thing, but Europe leads the world in terrorist attacks, and they have very strict gun laws, so,
Life, finds a way.
But far more people die every year from blunt force trauma than almost anything else.
TV watching.
TV viewing, they say, in a video!
Prescription drug abuse.
Prescription drug abuse only means too many doctors are overprescribing too many drugs, for better or worse. First world problems, man.
Prison population.
And yes, the prisons are full of all of those mass shooters! I never understood this one. One would think having a lot of criminals behind bars would be a good thing?
Oh, and almost #1 on environmental damage, edged out by China.
Oh, hold on there, fella. You know what? We pulled out of the what the fuck? The pirates. Ha ha! Chips ahoy there, matey! Oh, not so fast there, Roger Ramjet. We pulled out of the Paris climate deal and are leading the world in reducing carbon emissions. In 2017, U.S. emissions declined by 42 million tons. That's 758 million metric tons since 2005. While almost every other country has either shown zero progress or have increased carbon emissions, like China, that have increased by 3 billion tons in that same time, and India, which grew by 1 billion tons. Our neighbors to the north aren't faring much better either, eh? So, suck my low emissions tailpipe, assholes!
Hell yeah! Democracy wins!
Early, please, stop. Being American is the thing to do. That way you can help us get rid of all the immigrants.
It's gotten to a point where I think there are specific times and places where you can confuse America for a developing country, as elections are tampered with, water can't be drunk from taps, citizens don't trust uniformed officers, infrastructure is crumbling.
Confuse America for developing countries, huh? Wherever in the country could he possibly be talking about? All failed ultra-liberal cities that are, ironically, the richest cities in the country and seem to have little to no interest in fixing the problems. Castrating police, revolving door incarceration policies, and creating public health concerns like typhus outbreaks. The plague is making a big comeback, kids, by allowing people to live in filth in close proximity to each other. This all gets back to our fall from grace from a functioning democracy. Now, election tampering, that should just be called business as usual in God's waiting room, as it always seems to stem from Florida not trusting police is from groups like Black Lives Matter being backed by the mainstream media and the Obama administration promulgating the false narrative that unjustified police shootings are the biggest problem facing the black community. As far as drinking water, yes, aside from the obvious problems in Flint, millions of people, mainly in poor counties across the country, have drinking water that is considered below standards, obviously because of dirty water sources. Places like Oklahoma and Texas, where hot summer months are breeding grounds for bacteria. This all comes back to infrastructure and can be fixed. While some want to take trillions of dollars to give everyone $1,000 a month, paid off student loans, or retrofit
Every gas station, residence, warehouse, farmhouse, hen house, outhouse, or doghouse
in America with solar panels to be environmentally friendly, despite the fact that we already lead the world in environmental causes, or give illegal aliens healthcare while taking money away from our veterans, instead of supporting our veterans, keeping illegals out of the country, making people pay off their fucking debts, and putting that money into maintaining things like bridges so people don't, oh gee, I don't know, die on their way to work maybe? But I guess not perishing in a bridge collapse isn't high on their list of priorities. But many poorer counties take advantage of privately owned water treatment plants, for example, by buying the water from them, which the New York Times seems to take issue with. So when they say this,
when health, education, and safety are increasingly privatized or driven by privilege, the truth is, how great America is really depends on how rich you are. Now, I'm not saying we're Pakistan or Nigeria or any number of what we like to call developing countries, but we're not perched as high above them as we'd like to think. We got so caught up in the rhetoric about America being the greatest country on earth that we've long ignored the cracks in our system.
The New York Times seems to think that if you aren't super rich in America, you live like citizens in countries that have privatized security and commodities like power and water, which is demonstrably false. I've already pointed out that America's poor live better than most of the rest of humanity. And really, we're not perched as high above Pakistan as we'd like to think. Well, besides their military and economy, what else does Pakistan suck at? Pakistan is among the highest in infant mortality rates, at 8.6 per 1,000 births. Now, that's nowhere near the top 10, but they're up there. Keep trying, Pakistan, you'll get there. 'Cause they've got high hopes. Only half the population is literate because in most communities, women aren't allowed to go to school, and they have the world's second highest number of children not attending school, at more than 5 million. They are an active sponsor of terrorism and a safe haven for terrorists from all over the globe. In fact, the only chart you'll see them topping is being the most active sponsor of terrorism. The war over which has cost the lives of more than 23,000 innocent civilians and 8,000 security personnel. They are ranked 167th in life expectancy, with an average lifespan of 67 years, mainly because in the last decade, there have been 550 separate terrorist attacks in Pakistan alone. Look, there is much to criticize in this country, and it would be dishonest of me to only pick out the sections that I can take apart. We are not perfect, not a single country is, but we have a lot to be proud about. To quote the great American Charlie Daniels, we may have done a little bit of fighting amongst ourselves, but you outside people best leave us alone, because we have the strongest military, the strongest economy, maybe not the best healthcare system, but the best healthcare in the world, and some of the most prestigious universities. Basically, all that the New York Times has shown is that we are the greatest country on earth. They are just nihilistic Marxists who don't like that we have the freedom to get hooked on pills, shoot our guns, eat cheeseburgers, and get fat. And how dare you use Bill Murray in your video? He is a national treasure. So God bless Bill Murray, God bless America, and get fucked, New York Times! If you like this video, please be sure to comment, like, share, subscribe! That would really mean a lot to me. There is a link to all of my sources and to the original video in the description. And until next time, go for the ring, grab the bull by the horns, grab it by the pussy. And thank you so much for watching.
We are not going to make promises we cannot and should not keep, and we are not going to try to buy the people's votes with their own money.
And the idea is that everyone gets access to medical care.
Every American adult between 18 and 64 will receive $1,000 a month, free and clear, no questions asked.
So yeah, I do believe that when we talk about public education in America today, in a rapidly changing world, we should have free tuition at public colleges and universities.
I like when Bernie talks. It's like he's writing an imaginary letter to Santa Claus. I know a few girls got sexually harassed in my campaign a few years ago. Their tits were grabbed in the shower and somebody finger popped somebody. I didn't know about it. I was out busy making the case. We'll try to do better. You fucking kids, get off my lawn.
I'm on my land. We're both in America, which used to be a good country, until they started letting people like you do whatever you want.
Hey, dog, where you at?
See?
Nub it! Yeah.